what I want to do now is to talk about a few of the specific features of Islamic public law. What kind of law is it, in as much as one can generalize, by looking at some of the interesting legal principles which it lays down, sometimes for the first time. Principle of Islamic law is the principle of presumption of innocence. And this it clearly shares with the English common law and its American derivatives. The Sharia assumes defendants to be innocent until proven guilty, not like the French system, which operates on the reverse assumption. Second interesting principle of Islamic law is called the principle of non-retroactivity, which means that a fatwa or a legal opinion issued by a competent authority is only applicable to the case which induced it and subsequent cases. Hence, you can't be punished for a crime that is not yet on the statute books. This was something of an innovation. Previous legal codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi, for instance, hadn't recognized this principle. Thirdly, the principle of the supremacy of the law. In contrast to most of the legal systems of the time of its emergence, the Sharia provided a uniform body of law that actually applied to the ruler as well as to the ruled. In classical theory, even the ruler was obliged to refer disputes in which he himself was involved to a judge. I think this is the principle that modern writers on jurisprudence refer to as the principle of limited sovereignty. There in classical Islamic law. Fourthly, the no less important point of the independence of the judiciary. As in modern Western jurisdictions, Islamic law acknowledges that judges can be paid by the state, but it insists that state interference in the legal process automatically invalidates any verdicts. So the caliph or the sultan has to keep his hands out. Fifthly, interesting notions of juridical personality, perhaps because of the religion's basic anthropology and its understanding of human beings as being individually accountable to God. Roman law and also traditional Hindu law regard the family as the fundamental legal unit of society. Islamic law replaces this with the individual, and as we've seen, the female individual counts as well as the male individual. Another recurrent feature of classical Islamic law was an office held by an individual called the Muhtasib. And this really doesn't have an exact equivalent in Western law. He's a kind of legal official who combines the duties of policeman with sort of on-the-spot magistrate. Traditionally, Muslim marketplaces have been the responsibility of a muhtasib. His job is to see that the scales are properly balanced, goods are not diluted or adulterated, and he even has powers to impose fines or other minor penalties on the spot. And that's quite alien to Western law, which assumes that you have a division of powers between the police and the judiciary. Major crimes, of course, would be referred to the local qadi or Islamic judge. Muhtasib. And some of the most interesting insights that we have into the working of medieval Islamic societies come from manuals written for muhtasibs, these officials in medieval Muslim cities. Important figures. Another important thing that Islamic law did, which really did much to shape the characteristic structure and temper of Muslim cities in particular, was an institution called the Waqf. Sometimes translated with the French term mortmain, although there are important distinctions. These are charitable trusts. An owner of property can create a waqf by a deed or in his will. And this is based on a hadith which describes how a landowner once came to the Prophet and asked him how he should dispose of his land. And the Prophet responded, "If you like, make the property inalienable and give the profit from it to charity." There are equivalents in Western law of this principle, but in practice many more properties and estates in classical Islamic cities were held in this way than was the case in medieval European cities. Some medieval Islamic cities, you might find that well over a third of buildings are actually Waqf properties, with the revenues going to support mosques or soup kitchens for the poor or whatever. Some cases, for instance, in Damascus, there's a famous Waqf whose revenue is dedicated in perpetuity to the feeding of stray cats. They can be used for almost any purpose that can be regarded as vaguely charitable. If you ever visit Cairo, you might want to stop by at what is the world's oldest eye hospital, which is the Qalawun Hospital, founded sometime in the 13th century. And the original Waqf document still exists, and it's been an eye hospital ever since, supplying free treatment to the local population. Nowadays, these Waqfs have usually been taken over by greedy, unscrupulous governments. Very often in Muslim countries, you'll find that there is a Waqf ministry, which can be a kind of ministry of religious affairs, which administers, usually rather badly, these Waqf properties. Further interesting aspect of Islamic law is that it gives a very high degree of discretion to the judge when compared to most Western jurisdictions. Even when there isn't a law in the text, the judge does have the authority to decide on the basis of the general principles, the morality of the religion, that an offence has been committed, and he can impose a penalty. Finally, let me add to this rather disconnected list another important principle, which is that classical Islamic law, on the basis of some pretty clear texts in the Quran, prohibits the taking and giving of riba, which is interest, usury. Islam, of course, is not doing anything original here. Along with almost all of the church fathers and with Aristotle, Islam's formative documents prohibit the taking and lending of money at interest, however modest the rate. And the Quran, this is Surah 2, verse 278, says that God himself declares war on those who do this. The idea seems to be that interest payments set up a power relationship, which is simply inimical to Muslim ideas of brotherhood and equality. It's also sometimes thought that it has a tendency to create an idle class of people, and also that it throws too much of the risk of a commercial enterprise on the shoulders of the borrower. Yeah?
Just backing up one question on the previous one. If a judge makes a decision based on the general principles of the case with no law, does his decision become precedent-setting for future cases?
That's another important question. It could informally figure in the deliberations of a later judge, but precedence, in the sense known in English common law, isn't a source of law in Islamic law. Not. So this important principle of riba, clearly the prohibition didn't get in the way of Islam being the principal commercial civilization of the medieval world. Famously, you could cash a check drawn on a bank in Cordoba in Shanghai with no difficulty. It was a hugely sophisticated commercial web. What Islamic law tended to do instead of riba was to institute a variety of techniques, of which perhaps the most important is known as Mudaraba. And if you've traveled in the Muslim world, you may see occasionally advertisements for Islamic banks, now growing quite fast. And the usual way in which they keep themselves going is this principle of Mudaraba, which is basically profit sharing. In 1977, we had the formation of something called the International Association of Islamic Banks. And really for the last 25 years, you've had banks operating according to profit sharing deals, rather akin to the methods of traditional Western merchant banks in many Muslim countries. And the principle is that money is advanced by the banker not by way of an outlay in which the risk is entirely on the borrower, while the lender merely receives his interest. The lender actually becomes a participant in the venture and bears a proportion of any profit or loss. So that entrepreneurs are protected against risk and the bank still gets a return. A failed entrepreneur is not going to be burdened with interest repayments that he can't meet, and the bank also has the incentive to investigate very carefully the projects in which it hopes to invest its funds. So it invests in things that are clearly viable rather than those that are simply well underwritten. These Islamic banks seem to have functioned moderately well. They've not been an overwhelming success. Generally, most governments, including most governments in the Muslim world, are skeptical or even hostile to them. Certainly the increasingly integrated global financial and banking system can't stand them because they tend to operate in their own little financial ghetto. A few of them have failed, but generally investors seem to get a return roughly commensurate to those offered by conventional banks. And there is also the added ethical consideration, because when you invest with an Islamic bank, you have an assurance that the money isn't going to be used to punish failed businessmen, for instance, or to invest in morally dubious schemes such as the drinks or the armaments or the gaming industries. Generally speaking, certainly in English banks, they have no duty to disclose exactly where your income or your investments are being applied.